and welcome to Chetan Bharat Learning, and in this class we're going to do current affairs for international relations from 7th of January to 14th of January. Alright, so there were some very interesting developments last week, so much so that we had to pick which ones to cover this week. So we're going to begin with the Qatar GCC agreement. What's that about? You must have heard of it in news. Then India's UN stint begins now. So what are the issues that are facing India at the United Nations Security Council, and what does it mean for India and the world order currently? All right, and then there is a constitutional crisis underway in Nepal. We're going to try and understand how does India's policies come into play, what should India do, and all of that. All right, so we're going to do these things. So let's begin with the Qatar GCC agreement. All right. Before we get into all of that, you should first do the geography of the area, all right? So this is the Sunnidom, right? The big Sunni countries of West Asia, all right? And 6 of these countries have gotten together and formed a Gulf Cooperation Council, all right? So we should know the countries that are part of the Gulf Cooperation Council, beginning from the behemoth that is Saudi Arabia, all right? Saudi Arabia is pretty much the leader of this grouping. Then we have Kuwait, then we have Bahrain, Qatar, UAE, and here we have Oman. All right, so these 6 countries together form the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the thing that you must note right now, which will come in handy later, is that for Qatar, the only land border that they have is through Saudi Arabia. All right, so they are in the Persian Gulf, so they have a lot of sea. They're literal to the Persian Gulf. However, despite their being literal to the Persian Gulf, their land connectivity is pretty much dependent on Saudi Arabia. All right, so Qatar becomes an important part of the story later on. Why is this in news? Because on January the 5th, there was an announcement out of the Gulf Cooperation Council that they have signed a solidarity and stability agreement, and they have ended a 3.5-year blockade of Qatar. All right. So the first question that arises out of this is, what was this blockade all about, right? So in 2017, what happened was Qatar was first banished from the GCC, from the Gulf Cooperation Council, and second, there was an economic blockade that was orchestrated by Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. So Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates both orchestrated an economic blockade of Qatar. All right. So what was the reason why they did so? There were 2 primary reasons. One is the fact that Qatar is too close to Iran. All right. So I've told you there is in earlier classes, I've told you that there is a geopolitical rivalry between the Sunni dominated countries of the Gulf and the Shia dominated country, that is Iran. And Turkey also falls into the mix, because even though Turkey is primarily Sunni, but still there is a geopolitical rivalry between Saudi Arabia and its neighbors and Iran and Turkey. All right, and within that geopolitical rivalry, Saudi Arabia has always been unhappy of the fact that Qatar has very strong ties with Iran. These ties arise from the fact that Qatar and Iran pretty much share the world's largest oil field and all of that. But Qatar's closeness with Iran does not fall into the Saudi Arabian vision of a united Sunni hood, right? Of Sunni countries united and working against Iran, right? So in this geopolitical rivalry, Qatar finds itself in the crosshairs, right? The second reason why this blockade was put to Qatar was because of Qatar's insistence on supporting Muslim Brotherhood, right? So Muslim Brotherhood is this popular movement across the Muslim world, especially in West Asia and in Asia also, where they try to shift or try to come to an agreement with the state, where state is dominated by Islamic influences, which is called Islamism. All right, that state should have Islamic features, or state should adhere to the principles of Islam, which is called an Islamist ideology, right? So in Syria, in Egypt, after the Arab Spring, what happened was Mohammed Morsi took part in the first open democratic elections. Mohammed Morsi was from Muslim Brotherhood, and he was so Islamist in his outlook that Abdul Fattah al-Sisi, the current military dictator of Egypt, took power and jailed Mohammed Morsi, and Mohammed Morsi recently died also, right? Then Muslim Brotherhood has always been considered a big threat into UAE also, right? United Arab Emirates. The monarchy of United Arab Emirates has never enjoyed seeing eye to eye with Muslim Brotherhood. They've always felt that Muslim Brotherhood is a threat to the monarchy, right? Because Muslim Brotherhood is very heavily Islamist in its approach to how society and state should be organized, and that has always been considered as an existential threat to the monarchies of this region, right? So these countries were not happy that whenever they force Muslim Brotherhood leaders to flee their countries, they always lodge in Qatar, right? So that was one of the reasons why this happened. So there are two primary reasons: one, geopolitical rivalry with Iran, where Qatar is an important player, and the second is the fact that Muslim Brotherhood, right? So as I've told you, they allege that Muslim Brotherhood is being harbored or supported by Qatar. Then Egypt and United Arab Emirates, as I've told you, have considered Muslim Brotherhood as a huge security threat for them. And is in Saudi Arabia and Bahrain's concern and UAE's concern is that they're too close to Iran. All right. So what happened when the blockade happened in 2017? These Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, they severed diplomatic and trade ties with Bahrain. Okay, so Qatar's only land border, which is through Saudi Arabia, which I asked you to take a note of, was blocked. Right, ships flying Qatari under Qatari flags were not given access to ports in the region, and a lot of their airspace, which is contiguous with these Arab countries, was blocked. Right, so this was a severe embargo, and 13 demands were put forward to Qatar. One of those demands, or the most prominent, the demand that made a lot of highlights, was the fact that they wanted Al Jazeera closed down, right? So they said, like, we don't like the fact that Al Jazeera is on air. Okay? So that happened. And then besides that, there are other Qatari news outlets that are very prominent in the Arab world, all right? So Al Jazeera has an outsized role in the media landscape of the Arab world, and the journalists that man Al Jazeera are mostly Western journalists, right, or across the world, and the ethos and the values that they carry are fairly liberal and democratic and very Western in nature. And these Sunnihood monarchies do not appreciate that, right? So many journalists that are captured in Egypt and across this region are Al Jazeera journalists, right? So Al Jazeera has been this thorn at their side, and they don't like that, right? Because it shapes public perceptions in this region, right? Then they asked Qatar to downgrade their diplomatic ties with Iran, and they wanted there is a Turkish military base in Qatar. They wanted that closed down. And they requested Qatar to stop its interference in other countries' affairs, right? Because they've always claimed that a lot of Qatari money flows to Iran and Iran in its ventures, right? So that was the idea. Those were some of the important demands that came up, right? At the core of all this is that Qatar has always always punched above its weight in international relations, right? It's a small country, and that punching above its weight has been on account of two primary considerations, right? First is the fact that it has an outsized role in shaping public perception through Al Jazeera and many other Arab language news outlets, right, that are very prominent. So much so that Saudi Arabia had to field its own news channel to sort of rival the dominance that Qatari news outlets had, right? And the second is the fact that Qatar is excessively rich, right? So despite this blockade, Qatar was able to maintain its economy by using up all the reserves that they have accumulated when oil was trading at a much higher price, right? So Qatar, on account of these two factors, has always been this very important player in not only Western Asia but across the world, especially in Asia, right? So that is another consideration. So Saudi Arabia pretty much wanted to punish Qatar for towing its own line on international relations, especially with respect to Iran, right? Iran was the red line that didn't want Qatar to cross, and Qatar was always very close to Iran, right? So then what happened? The Sheikh, the Emir of Qatar, said that we are not going to surrender our sovereignty, and this blockade is illegal in international law, right? So it's not in conformity with international law. Then the emirate here means not United Arab Emirates, the Qatar, which itself is an emirate, right? So they quickly established new trade routes with Iran and Turkey to ensure that their population of 30 lakhs is supplied with essential supplies. and they used up their oil and gas reserve money to ensure that the economy does not collapse altogether. They could do that because they're a rich country, right? Then there were two states within the Gulf Cooperation Council that did not sever ties with Qatar, being Oman and Kuwait. Now, Kuwait actually was the mediator in all of this, right? Kuwait did not cut off connections with Qatar, and Kuwait wanted to have an amicable resolution to this problem. In fact, this deal that was announced actually was announced via Kuwait, right? So then the question that is, why conciliation now? What's the point of conciliation now? There are three reasons, actually two reasons, and those could be grouped under geopolitical and geo-economic, right? Let's come to the economic part of it, right? So, Saudi Arabia has always been dependent on its massive oil wealth, right? This has sustained its economy for a very long time. Now, most energy experts are predicting that oil and gas and coal are going to play a less and of a role in the international economy from now on, right? And you've seen that because we saw like negative oil prices also, and oil prices are generally like plunging across the board, right? So Saudi Arabia, which has been dependent on high oil prices to sustain its economy, right, cannot be so sure of it now. Then this economic wealth, right, that has always legitimized the monarchy of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been able to tell its people that you don't need fundamental rights and all of that crap from other countries because we are giving you wealth, right? So that legitimacy is bound to be challenged once the revenue from oil stops coming in. Now, the new crown prince Mohammed bin Salman understands this, and he has started this massive agenda of reform, of structural reforms in the Saudi Arabian economy, so that it turns into a capital economy, an economy that invests well and earns its income through capital, right? And so Saudi Arabia has made this very interesting investments, for example, in Gujarat and all of that, right? So if you have to really restructure our economy at that fundamental level, you will need economic resources, right? So if you need economic resources at home, then you need to focus at home, right? If so much of your resources are being spent on foreign policy and like intervening in other countries' affairs, you're not going to be able to pull off whatever you're trying to do at home, right? So much of money has been spent on ensuring that countries comply with the blockade on Qatar. So much of foreign diplomatic capital has been employed on this. Saudi Arabia itself has faced issues in the blockade because they couldn't trade with a natural partner that they have in the region, right? So now that geo-economic reality is sort of dawning on Saudi Arabia, and they've decided that enough is enough. We've punished Qatar enough, right? The second is the geopolitical reality. And that is to do with the fact that there is going to be a new administration in town, new US administration in town, right? And that new US administration might not be as favorable to Saudi Arabia as the Trump administration was, right? Saudi Arabia was able to get away with a lot of things under the Trump administration. They might not be able to do that when Joe Biden takes power. Now, Saudi Arabia knows that it has a ton of challenges coming its way when Joe Biden takes power. It doesn't want Qatar to be another challenge, right? Then the impact of the blockade on Qatar did not yield the results that everyone expected or that Saudi Arabia calculated. For example, Saudi Arabia wanted to cut off Qatari ties with Iran under this pressure, right? The pressure of blockade. In fact, now the Qatari ties with Iran and Turkey are even more stronger, right? And Qatar's involved because Turkey and Iran supplied those essential necessities that Qatar needed, and Qataris would never forget that help in emergency, right? So Saudi Arabia thinks that the impact that they wanted to have on Qatar has not really happened, right? So it has resulted into the effect is almost opposite to what they had hoped for, right? So that geopolitical reality is also dawning on them. The other part of this geopolitical reality is that they are improving their relations with the Satan, right, with Israel, right? So they consider Israel to be that uniting Satan, right? All the countries against Israel. So you have heard of Abraham Accords, and you've heard of the agreement with Sudan and the agreement with Morocco. So Israel is normalizing relations with countries around the Gulf, right? And Saudi Arabia wants Qatar to do the same, because Qatar is very close to Iran, so it wanted to take away Qatar's involvement with Iran, right? So there is that. And the third factor, which I've told you, that there is a new administration in town, that Donald Trump sort of pushed for this also, right? So that is why conciliation made sense now. Donald Trump factor is an interesting one, which is what I wanted to highlight. Why is it so interesting? Is because when the economic blockade was imposed, Donald Trump made a statement that Qatar is a funder of terror, right? Is good with words. So he said they fund terrorism, right? And everyone was shocked, because United States and Qatar are very close allies, and to the extent that United States has a very massive military base in Qatar, right? Through which they sort of keep an eye on the oil shipments. So this extent, the partnership of this extent was just jeopardized as soon as Saudi Arabia imposed economic blockade, because Donald Trump said they're a funder of terror. Now, in the same year, Donald Trump then was advised by his advisors to take a more neutral stance, and then he applauded Sheikh Tamim, who is the emir of Qatar, for his work on combating terrorist financing at a White House meeting. So he went from Qatar being financing terrorism to working on Qatar working on combating terrorism finances, right? So you can see that neutral stance. And then United States pretty much started pushing for a conciliation, and we recently saw that Jared Kushner, who's a senior advisor to Donald Trump, visited Saudi Arabia and visited Qatar to ensure that there is a deal at the end of it. Now, most commentators say that this is a part of legacy shopping, right? Easy things that you can pull off, that you can later put on your CV and say that we did this, right? We ensured that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are back as partners in the Gulf Cooperation Council, right? So that is what has happened. Why is it important for India? Because a lot of the people, a lot of Indians work in Gulf countries, and after COVID happened, they had to come back. So India needs to maintain close relations with all of these countries, and these internal differences between these two Gulf nations created quite an issue for us, right? So there is this Diplomat article that assessed the response that India and China had to the blockade and what impact it made. It comes to the conclusion that out of all of this, the only thing that you can say is that India and China's ties with the Gulf are now resilient. Why resilient? Because we have proven that we can ride the political waves in the region. What does that mean? That means that even if there is internal strife within this region, which is bound to be, we did not take active sides for one against another, and this was a sustainable position, right? When it was clear that we are going to have a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia, Qatar did not say India is like bad now, right? And so it was a sustainable position, and the same goes for China. Right, so you could imagine that, like, before the blockade, we had good relations with both the groups, with Qatar and with the other countries of GCC. During the blockade, we maintained neutrality, and we continued to work on our relationship with both these blocs. And what happened as soon as the news came in that there is going to be an agreement, Prime Minister Modi spoke to the Qatari Emir last month, and then our External Affairs Minister visited Doha, the capital, and like they started talking, right? So we sort of anticipated that there was a possibility for a reconciliation. We started working to ensure that there is profitable engagement with them, right? So the reason of state, like the main rationale for India trying to ensure that we are on good terms with all these countries, is because we want a swift return of our workers to these countries, because their families are dependent on remittances from these areas, right? So that is why Jaishankar, our foreign affairs minister, visited these countries, right? And then the important bit that came out of this was that Prime Minister Modi had a discussion with had a discussion with the Qatari Emir about ensuring that Qatari investment finds its way to India through a special channel and all of that. So you can see India already trying to ensure that that whatever time was lost in accelerating our ties with Qatar is made up for now, right? So that is why this has been hailed as a diplomatic achievement of India, that we were able to ride the political waves in the Gulf Cooperation Council, right? So then let's move on to India now being elected as a member, as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, I'm not going to go into what is United Nations, what is General Assembly, what is Security Council, because that is part of your static and you're supposed to know. And if you don't know, you should read up on that, right? So we're going to approach this from a very GS perspective, from a very mains perspective, to ensure that whatever news you read about India's activities or India's engagement with other countries at the Security Council is placed in a context, right? There's a reason why India would do certain things and won't do certain things. Right? So there are going to be three challenges or three broad issues that are going to shape India's response to issues at the United Nations Security Council, right? So let's look at all of them. The first is China, right? You know that China is now our nemesis, right? We have a big conflict raging with China. And there are other countries also who have the same problem with China, and China is on that Security Council now. Right, so our work is going to be aided by the fact that Vietnam will also be a non-permanent member of the Security Council alongside us. So we have United States, which is already like very very antithetical to Chinese interventions anywhere. Then we have United Kingdom also. We're not very sure about European Union, although only France is on the council, but we don't quite know what they are going to do. But we can see that there is an anti-China movement that is going to now happen on the Security Council. We want to be a part of that wave alongside other non-permanent members. So you can see that China is going to shape our response. So if you really want to know what it's about, think of a conflict that rages between China and Taiwan, right? Let's say China wants to take over a small island in Taiwan. It's testing the Western powers, whether they have the capability to rise up, right, to the challenge. So in case that happens, and it's been predicated, and it's been sort of, people have been saying that this is going to happen, then what is going to be our stance, right? Generally, if we were not on the Security Council, or if we were on the Security Council before this, then we would have come out with a statement that we want like countries to be peaceful and all of that. And now we can't afford to do that. We need to really push for anti-China stances wherever we feel so, right? So that is going to determine our behavior at the United Nations Security Council. The second thing that we're going to have to be very mindful of is the fact that okay, think of the Security Council, important players in the Security Council. There is China, we are antithetical to China. There is United States, we are going to be in cahoots with the United States in ensuring that China does not cross certain boundaries. What is the other player, the big player? That is Russia, right? And we have been historically been in some sort of a semi-alliance with Russia, 1971 onwards, right? Very close relations. In fact, when Prime Minister Modi was in Russia, he said, you ask any child in India and he's going to say, and you ask him who is the closest friend, he's going to say Russia. So it's very important to us that we continue to be a close partner of Russia. But at the same time, we have a growing semi-alliance sort of a deal with United States also, because United States is proving to be a helping hand in us countering China, right? So this conflict, right, this contradiction will play a major role, right? So for example, in recent times, Russia has expressed its inconvenience at India trying to push the Indo-Pacific narrative, right? Then this contradiction also comes out in the open when India tries to buy S-400 missiles from Russia, right? The United States threatening us with CAATSA sanctions, right? So this might not hold. This policy of ensuring that we're on good terms with everyone in the world might not hold, right? But we really want to ensure that we continue to be on good terms with Russia, because it is such an important partner, right? A word on the Russia-Chinese alliance also. There are two schools of thought whether Russia and China would be in alliance or not. One is it's in the very theoretical domain, like structural realism and all of that. But you need to know that some scholars say that Russia and China can be in alliance in countering US influence, and some scholars say that it's not possible. Russia and China have too many structural issues, right? So for example, If we have to take an example, think of the region that falls in between Russia and China, right? Central Asia, the stans of Central Asia, right? So historically they have been under the Russian influence, and China is increasing its influence in this region through Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all of that, which is the reason why Russia wanted India to be a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, to act as a counterweight to China to the extent that it can be, right? So there is one contradiction. The other contradiction is the fact that Russia has so many historical claims on other lands and seas, right? So South China Sea, what is the Chinese claim? That it's been within our purview, right? So or even Tawang, what is their claim? That historically Tawang has been a part of China, and hence by extension it has been a part of China, right? So Tawang being a part of Tibet, and by extension it being a part of China. So that has been the sort of claims that they make. Now, if they make these claims, then the Vladivostok region, the Far East region, it's ethnically more Chinese than Russian, and the people have sort of posited that China will one day make a claim to that region also, right? So there are these contradictions that could not be resolved in that alliance also. So the idea earlier was that India would play on these differences between Russia and China, but now we are seeing that Russia and China are increasingly acting together to act as a counterweight to Russia. So we have to ensure that we do not come up as we have to ensure that we act neutral if there is a conflict between United States and Russia, and God forbid if there is a conflict between United States and Russia, or at some proxy place, and we are asked to take a stance, what will we do? God knows, right? So that management is going to be a huge part of it, right? And then there is a post-COVID world order being shaped, right? There is new multilateralism. The new issues will come up, and global order, because the post-World War order is coming to some sort of an end, right? WTO rules are going to be new, and a lot of things are going to be new. So we are going to be shaped by how the global economy is panning out, and we are going to be at the Security Council when this happens. So the idea that I want to communicate to you is agenda setting, right? A lot of the agenda setting is going to happen at the United Nations Security Council, and the overarching agenda has already been said, which is that we need a new set of international norms to deal with this world, and we are going to be at the center of it, right? So that is also going to shape our understanding of the world, or shape our role at the United Nations Security Council, right? So if you've understood these aspects of the challenges that we're going to face when we are on the United Nations Security Council, then you need to know some notable procedure points that are also important, right? These are not as important for your mains, but you should just know that this is how things get done, right? So each year General Assembly elects 5 non-permanent members out of 10 in total. For a 2-year term. Then there is a rule 144, that says that an outgoing member cannot be a member again for the non-permanent ones, right? Then there is a rule 92 that says that the election is to be held by a secret ballot. You should just know that the election is held by a secret ballot, and there are no nominations. You should, for example, know that to be elected on the Security Council, you need a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, right? These are things that you should know. All right. Then you should also know this very important fact that it's not as if anyone can be elected to the Security Council. There are certain rules, and a big part of that ensuring that not anyone gets elected is that the entire world is represented on the Security Council, right? So they've divided the world into groupings based on population and heft. For example, 5 of the seats of non-permanent Security Council are occupied by members from Africa and Asia, 1 from Eastern Europe, 2 from Latin America and Caribbean, and 2 from Western European and other countries, right, and the rest of the world. So there is a geographical there's a delimitation of sorts here, and it's very geographical and by population, right? So so India is now part of the grouping naturally from the African and Asian countries, right? So this is also something that you know. Now these could be asked in your prelims. That's why I thought this is important for you to know. Then let's come to the last topic of our day, which is the Nepal political crisis. The first thing that you should know is that we're not going to cover India-Nepal relations in detail, right? But we're going to go through the broad ideas of an Indo-Nepal relation, right? So what is the constitutional crisis, right? What is happening, that I'll tell you, right? So when the Nepalese constitution came into being in 2015-16, one of the biggest points of emphasis was that in the constitution, you should ensure that the Nepalese parliament could not be dissolved as easily as it was done earlier. right? So it was I think it's Article 76, if I'm not wrong, of the Nepalese constitution. It ensures that Nepali parliament could not be dissolved. That was the idea. Every article in 1516 was about how Nepalese parliament should not be dissolved as easily. So the current constitution limits the circumstances in under which Nepalese parliament could be dissolved, and limits the ways in which it could be dissolved, right? And despite all of that, what has happened is that the Nepalese Prime Minister KP Oli has recommended to the president that the Nepalese parliament should be dissolved, right? So when a constitutional authority as big as the president and the prime minister are try to subvert the constitution so overtly, we have what is called a constitutional crisis, right? Something that is so blatantly unconstitutional done by an authority entrusted with following the constitution, right? Entrusted with ensuring that the constitution is followed, right? That is the definition of a constitutional crisis. Now we have that. Now in normal times, for example, if there was a constitutional crisis in Latin America, we wouldn't have covered this. But because Nepal is there, like in the region, in our neighborhood, there were commentators who've said that we are so close that our intestines are lodged into each other's guts, right? So that's how close India and Nepal are. So that makes it important that we come to an understanding of this scenario in international relations. So what's the problem? The problem is whether to intervene or not to intervene. That's the dilemma, right? So we're going to answer that question, whether to intervene or not to intervene. But first, let's get to the current issues that sort of dominate the conversation on India-Nepal relations. The first and foremost is that there is a 1950 treaty, Peace and Friendship Treaty, which many Nepalese political scientists say reflects a very Curzonian attitude to things. Now, Lord Curzon, who was the Viceroy of India, believed in this policy of subduing neighbors, of ensuring that they follow a certain line, right? In the 1900s, that was his policy. Now, many people say that this treaty is the same and India is following the same policy, right? So this treaty has become some sort of a symbol of Nepal being subservient to Indian interests, right, within their country. So when that has happened, there is a strong call in Nepal to revise the treaty. So that is one big issue. The second big issue that you're mostly familiar with is the border issue, right? The Kala Pani issue that happened. KP Oli passed a constitutional amendment that the Nepalese map became a part of the constitution and it contained areas that are ours, right? So that border issue is a big part of the conversation on India-Nepal relations. Then there is a conversation on the increasing Chinese influence, right? So what you need to understand is that China was the one. So before all of this, before the 1516 election, there were many communist parties in China. All of them came together to contest the election, which was in the aftermath of the economic blockade that India put on Nepal, right? And China was instrumental in ensuring that the alliance holds, right? In fact, some say that China was instrumental in ensuring that the most anti-India figure in that alliance, KP Oli, becomes the prime minister, right? So China was a big part of political developments in the past decade, right, in Nepal, especially after 2014, right, when the previous Nepali Congress government lost power. Now, what has this resulted in? This has resulted in a few things. One is that China came to wield enormous influence in the Nepal Communist Party government, right? China then ousted India as the #1 investor in Nepal, right? Then Nepal's foreign policy, people say, is pretty much under the influence of China. It's very pro-China. Whenever they have to take a decision between India and China, it's very pro-China, to the extent that the Nepalese Prime Minister, when this coronavirus thing was going on, made a statement that the virus that is coming from India is far more dangerous than the virus that is coming from China, right? So it's an anti-India statement, such blatant disregard for the important partner that India is to Nepal, right? Then this could be evidence from the fact that now there is a political crisis going on. Chinese foreign minister was in Nepal ensuring that the alliance holds, right? However, what you need to know is that the alliance was always a tricky one, right? there were these factions of Communist Party had had none they've been violent towards each other, right? In areas, certain areas, there have been massive clashes between these communist parties amongst each other, and now suddenly they were asked to cooperate with each other, and obviously they have these ideological issues on how to deal with India, how to deal with China, and how to deal with United States, how to manage the economy, and whether it will be a state-led economy or a private economy. And then now there is a Hindutva wave also going on that wants to restore monarchy, right? So you can see that there's these internal contradictions within the Communist Party were very strong, and China could somehow taper over them but not fully resolve those contradictions, right? So this alliance, many people are now it was prescient of some commentators then, but many people are now saying that we always knew that this would happen, right? So you can see what is happening. Then there is this structural tug of war, right? Whenever you have two giant powers and there is a country sandwiched in between acting as a buffer state, both countries would vie for influence in that buffer state, and that country would play both sides to ensure that it gets the better out of the deal, right, with both these countries. And that's a structural element that happens whenever such a configuration of countries is present around the world. So that is going to continue to happen. The biggest point, the biggest change that I want to really help you absorb is the fact that the economic rationale for the Nepalese population is changing, right? So historically there have been many instances where Nepal has played a China card with India, right? We wondered if Nepal will continue being a close partner of India in the wake of Chinese influence, and we've always had this comfort at the back of our mind that the Nepalese economy is so predominantly dependent on India that we need not worry, right? We allow Nepalese people to come into India and practice their trade and commerce freely and all of that, right? Because it has always been cheaper for Nepali businessmen to trade with India because of the geographical issues in trading with China, and that has always been a very static thing, and that has provided some strategic comfort to the Indian diplomatic elite. Now what's happening is that some commentators say that the economic rationale is changing. Slowly, it is becoming easier and cheaper for Nepalese people to trade with Chinese people, and that is a matter of concern, right? So what should we do to address these issues? The first is that there was an eminent persons group established, and it also recommended that the peace and friendship treaty should be suitably amended, right? Then we should address the infrastructure need for Nepal. That is an important bit. And then we should shed this perception that Chinese are better at India than Indians in building things, right? That's a big part of why these small contracts and even big contracts go out of India's hand in Nepal, right? Then Nepal needs to assuage India that they are not going to allow China to influence their government and institutions in a way that is adversarial to India's interests, right? Then Nepal needs to ensure that it doesn't become like the second Pakistani hand. For example, there is so much black money that comes into counterfeit currency that comes into India through Nepalese route. There are so many terrorists that sort of run into Nepal. Where there are stories of how Indian intelligence agents have to nab people from Nepal, right? So Nepal cannot act as a ground for Pakistan to act against India, right? So that is an important bit. Then we also need to minimize our internal interference in our interference in the internal affairs of Nepal, right? And then we're going to come to the other question, and then like SAARC, right? SAARC is an important point here. Nirupama Subramaniam and other commentators have repeatedly said that BBIN and BIMSTEC is no substitute for SAARC. SAARC needs to be the forum where India and Nepal do things, where India and the problem is that Pakistan is going to be there, but we need to continue to work towards ensuring that SAARC becomes functional, right? That is where Nepal would feel very secure, right? So we need to continue working on SAARC. Now, this interference part, let's ask that question now, to intervene or not to intervene, right? In Maldives, when there was an election and there were threats of a military takeover by a party in Maldives that was antithetical to India, we did not intervene. And then a party that was pro-India came to power. It was a coalition that came to power. So many experts said India's non-interventionist stance in Maldives was vindicated, right? Even now what is happening is that China is publicly intervening, right? Chinese foreign minister came to Nepal to ensure that the alliance, the communist alliance holds. And it would be in India's interest if China is publicly failing, right? If everyone sees that China fails, right? Because the contradictions within these communist parties in Nepal is too overbearing. And people have seen Chinese foreign minister in Nepal. So people are seeing that China is trying to ensure that the alliance holds. But people also know that this alliance is very difficult to continue, right? So once people see Chinese intervention that deeply, and once people see that that Chinese intervention fails, then we could say that we are vindicated. Our non-interventionist stance is vindicated because we are not intervening right now. So maybe the correct trajectory right now is to not intervene, right? Because we do not want to give another reason for KP Oli to say that, look, there is an India threat and somehow hold on to power, right? So that. Now, besides this, there are two things that I quickly want to bring to your attention. One is that there is a EU-China investment deal, right? The terms of the deal are not that strong. Even the economic consequences of that deal are not very strong on either of the parties. The biggest beneficiary of this deal would be Germany because there were last minute concessions by China. However, think of the image, right? European Union coming to an agreement, an investment agreement with China when a new administration is taking power. Think of the geopolitical shockwaves that it will send around the world, right? So you should know that there is an agreement. You shouldn't bother with the details of it. The second thing that I wanted to consider is that there is a document that has been declassified that came out with the United States policy on Indo-Pacific, right? That Indo-Pacific document, which is just a couple of years old, has been declassified. Now, generally, US administration declassifies documents that have been over 30 and 20 years old, right? But this was declassified so soon, right? So the internal politics of declassification are not important, but I really recommend that you go through the articles that talk about what it says about India, right? Because now you get to know, like, what do they think about the importance of India, Australia, and Japan when no one is looking, right? Behind closed doors, what is their assessment of what is happening in Indo-Pacific, right? So because this has been declassified only yesterday and the conversation is only just beginning, I didn't cover it here. The conversation, there are going to be a lot of articles in newspapers about this declassification, what the document says, and we're going to cover all of them in the next class, but I expect you to prepare till then, right? So that's it for the day. I hope you're reading your newspapers and take care of yourself, and bye-bye.